Her husband texted her saying he was leaving, but what she did next changed everything. The morning sun barely filtered through the blinds when her phone buzzed. Still in her robe, holding a warm mug of coffee, she glanced down at the notification. One message. Just one line. I'm leaving. Don't wait up. No explanation. No goodbye. No mention of why or where. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she set the mug down without spilling a drop. The silence of the kitchen grew louder than ever, as if every sound had been sucked out of the air. She read the message again, wondering if there had been a mistake. But it was real. After 12 years of marriage, he had ended it with a text. She stood there, staring blankly at the pale yellow walls of their kitchen, the same ones they had painted together, laughing, now echoing a memory that felt like it belonged to someone else. A part of her wanted to scream, to call him and demand answers. But something inside her, something deep and quiet, told her not to chase. Instead, she placed the phone on the counter, finished her coffee slowly, and began to move, not with anger, but with clarity. He had made his choice. She would make hers too. By the time the front door opened that evening, his bags were already packed and placed neatly by the entrance. He walked in with a calm arrogance, like someone expecting to deal with chaos, maybe tears, maybe begging. But what he found instead was unsettling: her silence. No accusations. No questions. Just her sitting on the couch, flipping through a photo album, almost detached. For a moment, he stood there frozen, as if uncertain whether to speak. "You packed my stuff?" he finally asked, not even pretending to be surprised. She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the page. A picture of them smiling on a beach stared back at her. "You said you were leaving," she said calmly, her voice without tremor. "So I made it easier." The coldness wasn't anger, it was conviction. He tried to read her face, searching for signs of pain he could control or manipulate. But there was nothing. She wasn't broken. She wasn't lost. That unsettled him more than any tears could have. And when she opened the door for him, he walked out not feeling victorious, but oddly dismissed. Before stepping outside, he paused and turned around. Perhaps to provoke. Perhaps to reclaim some power. "You'll be nothing without me," he said, his voice laced with cruel confidence. "You were always just a shadow. No career, no direction. I gave you everything. You'll see." The words echoed through the hallway like poison. But she didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed on the photo album, and her fingers calmly flipped the page. For a split second, his bravado cracked. He waited for a reaction, for proof that he still mattered. But she said nothing. That silence spoke louder than any scream. He hesitated again, hand on the doorknob, but when she finally looked up, her expression wasn't sad, it was unreadable. That scared him more than anger. "Take care," she said, and shut the door behind him before he could say anything else. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the dry leaves on the porch. He stood there, feeling the weight of the bags he once thought she couldn't live without. Inside, she leaned against the door, closed her eyes for a moment, and let out a long, controlled breath. Not because she was weak, but because she had decided not to be. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful, it was deafening. The spaces he used to occupy now felt exaggerated in their emptiness. She walked through the living room and sat at the dining table where countless dinners had been served, where conversations had once filled the air with laughter and plans. Now it was just quiet. The ticking clock on the wall grew louder with every second, and she realized it had been a long time since she'd actually listened to it. Time had passed, and she had stopped hearing it. That bothered her more than the empty chair across from her. She moved through the house slowly, not as someone mourning, but as someone inspecting a place she no longer recognized. His jackets in the closet were gone, his shoes no longer near the door, and the shelf by the bathroom sink, once cluttered with his razors and aftershave, was pristine. She opened drawers and closets, each revealing more space than she remembered. But with every empty space, she also felt something else. Not loss, but possibility. There was room now. Room to breathe, room to think, room to rebuild. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was the start of it. The next morning, she woke up before sunrise. The bed felt enormous without his weight beside her, and the cold sheet on his side was a quiet reminder of the night before. She stared at the ceiling, allowing the stillness to settle around her. And then, without any particular reason, she got up. She stripped the bed, opened every window, and let the air rush in. For the first time in years, she turned on music, old jazz she hadn't listened to since her 20s, and let it echo through the house. She began cleaning, not just for order, but for renewal. She worked through the day, clearing out not just his things, but also the energy he had left behind. The house began to smell like lemon and lavender, not cologne and dust. She moved with purpose, sorting through drawers, cabinets, and files. She found old notebooks filled with ideas she had once jotted down, things she meant to do one day. Dreams she had shelved to support someone who never truly saw her. As the day faded into dusk, she sat on the floor, surrounded by piles of paper and memories. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel abandoned. She felt reclaimed. In one of the bottom drawers of her old desk, covered in dust and untouched for years, she found a binder full of notes, sketches, and handwritten recipes. Each page carried a scent of nostalgia, vanilla, cinnamon, lemon zest. They were fragments of a life she had once imagined, owning a small cafe, serving homemade desserts, and watching strangers become regulars. Back then, he had called those dreams cute distractions, something to keep her busy while he chased real goals. But now, flipping through the pages, they felt like seeds buried too deep for light, until now. She sat on the floor, the binder in her lap, and remembered the evenings spent experimenting with flavors, the joy of sharing new creations with friends who once believed in her. Somewhere along the way, her ambitions had been quietly folded into someone else's vision. But they had never truly vanished. The more she read, the more vivid her old dreams became. They weren't childish. They were hers. They were real. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine again, not escape, not fantasy, but something tangible. Something that could be built. Starting over didn't begin with grand gestures, it began with small, deliberate steps. She pulled out the mixer from the cabinet, wiped the rust off the baking pans, and bought fresh ingredients with careful attention. The first batch of cookies came out uneven, some too browned, others underbaked. Still, she placed them in boxes lined with parchment paper and tied each one with a ribbon, like she used to do in her 20s. There was no customer yet. Just her, baking in a quiet kitchen, creating warmth in a house still echoing with cold farewells. That weekend, she brought the boxes to the community park and set up a simple wooden table near the entrance. She didn't have a banner, just a hand-painted sign that read, "Home Bakes by Chapter 2. Passers-by smiled politely, a few stopped, some bought. But mostly, she was invisible. Still, when a woman returned the next day asking for the lemon cookies with the soft center, her heart swelled. It wasn't about money, not yet. It was about planting something again. Something that was hers, and hers alone. The small spark of her endeavor began to reach the ears of those around town. Some neighbors admired her courage, calling her strong. Others, however, weren't so kind. "Isn't she the one whose husband ran off?" whispered a woman at the grocery store, loud enough to be heard but soft enough to deny. Another snorted, "Now she's selling cookies like a school fundraiser." Her cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. That silence had become her shield, not out of fear, but because she refused to explain her worth to those who only saw the ruins, not the rebuild. She went home that evening with heavy arms and a heavier heart. Doubt crept in, subtle but steady, like water leaking through old tiles. Was she being foolish? Chasing a dream too late, too visibly? Yet as she placed her ingredients on the counter, her hands moved instinctively. The judgment stung, but it didn't stop her. In fact, it fueled her. Because what they didn't see was the woman she was becoming, not the one left behind, but the one who chose to begin again, even while people watched and waited for her to fail. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, she set up her stand under a large tree in the town square, shielding it with a makeshift tarp. Her display was perfect: fresh brownies, spiced muffins, jars of homemade jam. But no one came. The foot traffic was thin, the weather bleak, and after hours of waiting, she packed everything up with numb hands and a tight throat. Not one sale. The silence around her wasn't just quiet, it was humiliating. It echoed his words, "You'll be nothing without me." That day, she almost believed him. She drove home in silence, the uneaten pastries beside her like proof of failure. She sat in the kitchen with the lights off, staring at the window as raindrops slid down the glass. Maybe the world wasn't waiting for her to rise. Maybe it didn't care. But as she reached to toss a tray into the trash, she paused. What if tomorrow someone needed exactly what she made today? Not every attempt would bloom, but she had survived worse than disappointment. And so, she saved everything. Because quitting would mean he was right. And she was done letting him be right. The following morning, she returned to the park, same table, same sign. She set everything up, expecting little. But then, the elderly woman from last week returned, wrapped in a wool scarf, holding an umbrella that dripped rain onto the pavement. She picked up a cookie and took a bite. Her eyes softened. "This tastes like home," she said, smiling through thin lips. That single sentence wrapped itself around the woman's heart tighter than any compliment ever had. More customers began to trickle in, drawn not by advertisement but by word of mouth and something they couldn't quite describe. As the week passed, a few teenagers stopped by, intrigued. A young father bought muffins for his kids. A nurse from the nearby clinic came daily for a raspberry tart. And the table, once ignored, became a small fixture of comfort. She started to see familiar faces. She remembered names. Each transaction wasn't just a sale, it was a connection. The taste of something sweet carried stories with it. And in those stories, she found not just purpose, but healing. What had started as an escape from pain was now a quiet declaration: she was still here. And she had more to give. A few blocks from her home, there was an abandoned corner cafe with boarded windows and ivy creeping up its walls. She had walked past it hundreds of times, but now she saw it differently. The faded "for lease" sign looked less like a warning and more like a quiet invitation. With hesitant steps, she peered through a crack in the wood and saw a dusty counter, a broken espresso machine, and rows of empty shelves. But beneath the decay, she saw potential. It wasn't glamorous, but it had bones. It had character. It had silence waiting to be filled with warmth again. That evening, she contacted the number on the sign. The landlord, a gentle man in his 70s, agreed to meet her the next day. He seemed surprised by her interest but softened when she explained her dream. "Most people see ruin," he said. "You see a future." He offered her a generous deal, sympathetic to her limited savings. It would take everything she had, and more effort than she could imagine, but as she held the keys in her palm, a quiet strength took root. She wasn't just selling cookies anymore. She was building something from the ground up. The first week was spent sweeping floors, scrubbing tiles, and peeling away layers of dust and neglect. Friends from the neighborhood stopped by, some out of curiosity, others with offers to help. With borrowed tools and second-hand paint, she transformed the space day by day. She tore down a wall to open the dining area and painted the windowsills with sunflower yellow. A local carpenter offered to rebuild the counter in exchange for a month's worth of pastries. Little by little, the cafe began to reflect her spirit, resilient, vibrant, and quietly bold. When it came time to name the place, she stared at the blank board above the doorway for hours. Then, it came to her in a whisper, Chapter 2. Not just for the cafe, but for her life. This was the next chapter, no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she was choosing to create. She painted the letters herself, every stroke an act of defiance against the past. It was imperfect, but honest. And as the paint dried, she stood on the sidewalk, looking up at it, and felt, for the first time in a long time, like she belonged. The opening day of Chapter 2 arrived with soft sunshine and nervous anticipation. She wore a simple dress and tied her hair back, her hands trembling slightly as she unlocked the front door. Customers began to arrive, neighbors, former strangers, and curious passers-by. Laughter echoed off the new walls, and the scent of fresh bread and vanilla filled the air. But as the line reached the entrance, two familiar figures appeared. Her ex-husband, dressed sharply, and a younger woman clinging to his arm. They stepped inside like they owned the place. He looked around with mild amusement, then leaned over the counter and smirked. "So this is what you've been up to," he said, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. "A bakery?" His partner chuckled and added, "Charming. It smells like childhood in here." For a brief moment, the air felt colder. Her heart pounded. But she didn't shrink. Instead, she smiled politely and replied, "Welcome. We're fully booked today. But you're welcome to try again another time." She turned to the next guest without hesitation, leaving them standing awkwardly in a space they no longer belonged to. He stepped back, clearly irritated that his presence hadn't rattled her. He tried again. "Don't you want to talk? After everything?" She glanced at the line behind him and shook her head softly. "I'm working. I suggest you enjoy the view from the outside." The cafe had filled quickly, and the buzz of conversations resumed. People had noticed the exchange but didn't speak. Instead, their supportive eyes told her everything she needed to know. She had built something worthy. Not just of attention, but of respect. The younger woman tugged at his sleeve, clearly uncomfortable. "Let's go," she whispered. He hesitated, perhaps realizing that whatever grip he once held had vanished. As they exited, the bell above the door jingled cheerfully, as if marking a quiet victory. She watched them go, not with bitterness, but with clarity. This place wasn't just about pastries. It was about reclaiming space, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And today, she had done exactly that. Later that night, as she swept the floor and turned off the lights, she found herself reflecting on his face, the surprise, the frustration, the disbelief. There had been a time when she would have done anything for his approval. When his laughter shaped her choices and his silence wounded her more than words. But seeing him now, in her space, out of place, she realized something profound. She didn't need closure from him. She had already given that to herself. She brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window of her quiet cafe. The street outside glowed with the soft amber light of street lamps, and the occasional passerby paused to glance at the new sign above the door. She thought of the nights she had cried silently into her pillow, of the days she had doubted her worth. And now, those moments lived in the walls of this place, not as scars, but as bricks. Every tear, every failure, every humiliation, part of the foundation that held her up now. 2 days after the encounter with her ex, a young woman entered the cafe holding a camera and a notepad. She introduced herself as a freelance journalist for a local lifestyle blog. "I've heard about this place from 3 different people this week," she said, smiling. "Everyone keeps saying there's something special here, something healing." At first, the woman hesitated. She wasn't used to telling her story publicly. But the journalist's warmth reminded her of the people who had helped along the way. So, over a cup of tea, she shared how the cafe came to be. The article went live 3 days later. It wasn't just about pastries. It was about resilience, about building from heartbreak, about reclaiming identity through creativity and kindness. The piece was shared hundreds of times, and the cafe's name began to circulate far beyond the neighborhood. That weekend, the line outside wrapped around the corner. People came from nearby towns, saying they just wanted to see the place that made them believe in starting over. She served every guest with gratitude, not for their money, but for believing in her story. Late one evening, after closing, she sat alone at the back of the cafe and allowed herself to revisit the past, not to grieve, but to understand. She thought about the early years of the marriage, how he once made her laugh so easily, how they used to talk about the future while lying on the floor, imagining their first home. But over time, those conversations faded. The laughter turned into silence. Affection became obligation. The warmth slowly eroded into cold routine. She hadn't even noticed how invisible she had become, until one day, she realized she no longer recognized herself in the mirror. He hadn't needed to yell to break her down. His indifference did more damage than rage ever could. The way he dismissed her opinions, the way her hobbies were pointless, her friends immature, and her goals unrealistic. She remembered once baking a cake for their anniversary, only to have him arrive late and call it cute, before pushing it aside untouched. That moment stuck with her more than the fights. Because silence, too, can wound. And remembering it now only confirmed how far she had come since choosing herself. The disrespect hadn't started with big betrayals, it came in fragments, almost invisible at first. It was in the way he corrected her in front of guests, pretending it was just a joke. Or the way he'd sigh when she spoke of dreams he didn't understand. It was in the way he let her do all the emotional labor, while labeling her efforts overreactions. She remembered once applying for a small local art contest, just for fun. When she showed him her entry, he laughed. "What are you trying to prove?" That night, she cried in the bathroom so he wouldn't see. Over time, those small slights added up. She began to second-guess herself, hesitate before speaking, apologize even when she wasn't wrong. She dressed how he liked, cooked what he wanted, laughed when he expected. But with every compromise, something inside her faded. And the worst part? She thought that was love. That love meant shrinking to fit. Only now did she understand that real love doesn't require disappearance. It invites expansion. And this cafe, this chapter, was her expansion finally taking root. The turning point came subtly, when love stopped feeling like freedom and started feeling like a rulebook. He began tracking her whereabouts with casual questions disguised as care. Why did it take you so long at the store? Who was that friend again? Soon, her calendar filled with plans that weren't hers. She stopped attending book clubs, stopped visiting her sister, even stopped painting. At first, she convinced herself that compromise was part of commitment. But eventually, she realized she was only allowed to exist within the limits of his comfort. She remembered how quiet her world had become. The music she once danced to while cleaning had been replaced by podcasts he liked. The vibrant colors she loved in the living room were replaced with grays and neutrals to match his minimalist taste. One day, she looked around their home and realized nothing in it belonged to her anymore. Not even the woman standing in it. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with mourning. She had buried herself alive. And now, she was learning to breathe again. One of the most painful memories returned like a whisper on a busy afternoon. It had been their anniversary. She had spent days planning a small surprise dinner, baking from scratch, even printing an old photo of them laughing in their first apartment. She lit candles, wore the dress he once said made her look beautiful, and waited. He arrived an hour late, glanced at the table, and muttered, "You didn't have to do all this." He ate silently, barely speaking. When she asked if something was wrong, he said coldly, "I'm just tired. Can we not make this dramatic?" That night, she had curled into herself while he slept beside her, wondering what more she could have done to matter. The shame didn't come from his words, it came from her willingness to believe them. For years, she had walked on eggshells, trying not to be too much or too little. Always adjusting, always striving to be enough. But enough isn't something someone gives you. It's something you claim. And now, every customer who smiled at her pastries, every handwritten thank you note, every tearful hug from a stranger who saw themselves in her story, each one reminded her she had always been enough. Tucked between pages of an old planner, she found a letter she barely remembered writing. The paper was yellowed, folded multiple times, the ink slightly smudged. It was addressed to him, but it had no stamp, no envelope. She had written it in a moment of desperation, during a time when she still believed he might listen. In the letter, she pleaded for understanding, confessed how lost she felt, and begged for something, anything, to change. Reading it now, her hands trembled. Not from sadness, but from disbelief that she had once thought his validation was necessary for her survival. She set the letter down and stared out the window, watching the wind sway the trees outside. Back then, she didn't send it because a part of her knew the answer. He wouldn't have read it, not truly. He would have rolled his eyes or called her dramatic. The letter wasn't for him. It was for the version of herself who still hoped. Now, she didn't need that hope. She had herself, her business, her peace. So instead of burning the letter, she folded it again, placed it in a box labeled past, and locked it away. One rainy afternoon, as she was closing up the cafe, a woman entered, soaked and out of breath. She apologized for being late and asked if there were any pastries left. "Just a few," the owner replied warmly. The woman sat down with a cup of tea and a slice of lemon cake. After several minutes of silence, she whispered, "I left someone yesterday. Walked out with nothing but my coat and my keys." Their eyes met. No more words were needed. She brought the woman a second slice on the house and sat beside her until closing time. The next morning, a handwritten note was waiting on the front step. Your kindness reminded me I'm not broken. I'm just beginning. There was no name, no return address. But the message was clear. The cafe had become more than a business. It was a refuge, a symbol. People didn't just come for cookies, they came to feel seen. That day, she understood that healing, when shared, creates ripples. The strength she had fought to reclaim was quietly empowering others, even those just passing through. Weeks later, she received an unexpected email from a popular local podcast host. We'd love to feature your story, it read. Your cafe's message is exactly what our listeners need right now. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't used to microphones or interviews. Her story wasn't dramatic, it was slow, quiet, made up of thousands of moments most people ignored. But after thinking it over, she agreed. Not for fame. But because maybe someone out there, sitting in silence like she once did, needed to hear her voice say, "You can begin again." The podcast aired on a Tuesday. By Thursday, her inbox was flooded with messages. Women from different states shared stories of escape, of rebuilding, of resilience. Some wrote from shelters. Others from coffee shops during lunch breaks. One message stood out: I listened to your episode in my car before signing divorce papers. You gave me courage. She sat at her desk, hand over her mouth, and let the tears fall. Her pain had become purpose. And now, her voice, once silenced, was becoming an echo of hope. 1 month later, he returned. Not with arrogance this time, but with uncertainty. He entered the cafe quietly, wearing a suit that no longer fit right, his hair grayer than before. She spotted him immediately. The room seemed to pause. He approached the counter and asked if they could talk. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. She nodded once and gestured toward the quiet table by the window. They sat in silence for a moment. Then he said, I didn't think you'd make it without me. She looked him in the eyes and replied, I know. He spoke of regret, of how things didn't work out like he thought they would. How he remembered the way she used to hum while baking, and how empty his new home felt. But she didn't feel pity. Only clarity. You didn't break me, she said calmly. You pushed me toward myself. He nodded, defeated. He wasn't there to win her back. He was there because he finally saw what he'd lost. When he left, there was no drama, no shouting. Just the quiet understanding that some endings are necessary for better beginnings. The door closed behind him, and she stood there for a long moment, breathing in the stillness. It was a strange sensation, not triumph, not revenge, but release. For so long, she had waited for this moment. The apology. The admission. The chance to say everything she'd rehearsed in her head for years. But now that it had come, she realized something freeing: she owed him nothing. Not anger. Not forgiveness. Not even a response beyond what she had already said. Later that evening, as she washed the dishes behind the counter, she whispered the words she hadn't dared to say aloud. Thank you for leaving. Not out of bitterness, but out of truth. His absence had given her the space to return to herself. To become someone whole, not someone surviving. She looked around the cafe, the handwritten signs, the mismatched chairs, the photos of smiling guests on the bulletin board, and smiled. This wasn't a comeback. It was a continuation. And she had written every word. A week later, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside, a handwritten letter, carefully folded and written in neat, elegant cursive. It was from the woman her ex had left her for. The message wasn't cruel. It wasn't bitter. In fact, it was startlingly honest. "I thought I had one," the letter began. "But now I see I was just the next in line. He didn't love me. He just needed someone who didn't know who he really was yet." As she read, her fingers tensed, then relaxed. The woman wasn't looking for sympathy, just closure. At the end of the letter, the woman wrote, "I visited your cafe last month. You didn't recognize me. I sat by the window and watched you. And in that moment, I understood everything. He didn't leave you for someone better. He left you because he couldn't handle someone becoming more." That sentence echoed in her mind long after the letter was tucked away. It was the final thread of a story she no longer needed to carry. She didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. But for the first time, she felt like she had outgrown even the memory of him. Months passed, and Chapter 2 became more than a local gem, it became a destination. One morning, a national magazine listed it as one of the 10 small businesses that are changing lives. A journalist called, asking for an interview, and soon after, a photographer arrived to take portraits of the cafe, the staff, and its guests. When the article was published, it didn't just highlight the menu. It told her story, and the cafe's purpose, to be a place where people find comfort, courage, and community. The response was overwhelming. Strangers began writing letters, sending emails, even traveling across states just to sit at a table and say, "I heard about you. Thank you for existing." She watched it unfold with wonder. Not because of the attention, but because it affirmed what she already knew: pain, when transformed, can nourish others. Her life, once reduced to silence, now rang with laughter, conversation, and the clinking of coffee cups. And still, she remained the same woman who began it all, with a rolling pin, a quiet will, and a heart that refused to stay small. One rainy Sunday, just before closing, a woman entered the cafe wrapped in a long coat. Her steps were slow, careful. She looked older, familiar. When she reached the counter, she hesitated, then removed her hood. It was his mother. They hadn't spoken in years, not since the divorce papers were signed. She looked different. Tired. Softer. "I wasn't a good mother-in-law," she said, not looking up. "I believed his side of the story. I thought you were the weak one." The cafe owner said nothing. Just listened. The woman continued, her voice cracking. "I was wrong." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. Then, she motioned toward a slice of cake in the display and asked, "May I sit for a while?" She nodded and brought the plate herself. They sat in silence for a time, the rain tapping against the windows like a soft metronome. Finally, the older woman whispered, "You built something beautiful." She smiled, gently. Not in pride, but in peace. "Yes," she replied. "I did." That moment, quiet and human, healed something deeper than words could ever reach. She was invited to speak at a women's shelter a few towns away. At first, she felt unsure, what could she offer beyond her personal story? But as she stood in front of the room, looking at the faces of women who carried silent battles, she understood. She wasn't there to impress. She was there to remind them of what was possible. She told them about the empty house, the text message, the silence. But then she told them about the cookies, the tarp, the name on the door. She watched as their eyes lit up, not at her strength, but at the mirror it offered. Afterward, women approached her quietly, one by one, thanking her for being proof. Proof that it was okay to fall apart. Proof that it wasn't too late. Proof that life after abandonment wasn't just survival, it could be joy. She left the shelter that night with a full heart, realizing that her story was no longer about him. It was about everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, and chose to rewrite that ending. Chapter 2 wasn't just a place. It was a possibility. One chilly morning, she noticed a young woman sitting on the sidewalk bench across from the cafe. Her shoulders hunched, her face pale, and a duffel bag sat beside her. Something about her posture felt familiar. The owner stepped outside, a warm pastry in hand, and approached slowly. "It's okay," she said softly. "You're safe here." The girl looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "I don't know where to go," she murmured. The owner smiled gently and nodded toward the cafe. "Start with something sweet. Then we'll talk." That afternoon, they sat by the window, the same one where her ex-husband once tried to diminish her. But that memory was distant now. Faded. The girl smiled faintly after the first bite. "This tastes like home," she whispered. The cafe owner smiled, placing her hand over the girl's. "Then maybe this is where your story begins." As the sun set, casting golden light through the windows, Chapter 2 embraced yet another soul ready to start over. And the woman who once thought she had been left behind realized, with a full heart, that she had never been alone. Only becoming.